Michelle?
Daniel,
Oh,
OG
gee, Rose.
Rose, and Michelle, I'm gonna throw stuff at you.
Go for it.
Uh, so, um, belonging again tutu is it just likes to grow and kill you, and it's really funny. I guess I was reflecting on because
Mhm,
belonging again was written 2016. I suppose like the essay called "Belonging Again," around which
mm,
part one is
mhm,
written, which was
mm,
deeply indebted to Vincent Zimmer giving me "The Triumph of the Therapeutic"
mm,
by Philip
mhm,
Reef, then got into people like Peter Berger and so on. And the address ever since then of the explanation has been basically the expansion of the radical expansion of freed, not just free, but freed speech
mm,
as much as possible.
mm,
Then word spread policy like removing the college monopoly on credentials, changing the classroom from a trivia based structure to incubating more of an oral tradition and other things. And then, the fate of beauty is the fate of us, which we talked about beauty on our first book from long ago called Ironically,
mm,
which wanted to argue that irony is ontological and
mm,
so on and so forth. So there's at the core, the address um, is that. Now, the issue is as you expand, but what does that mean exactly? What
mm,
are the implications of that? Because why would you ever believe that freed speech would not only deal, and what does that mean? Right. And then how do you
mm,
have the capacity to handle freed speech? Like the ability to hear, not just to voice your opinion freely, like free speech is a legal category, but to be the kind of embodied person that has control over your nervous system to
mm,
handle freed speech, hearing things you disagree with, encountering
mm,
new ideas, to engage in philosophical discussion, so on and so forth. Now that all has to be expanded on a lot, but you know, but then like if that's the case, you
mhm,
got like why would that change economics? Why would
mm,
that change
mm,
politics? Why would that be a return to like why is that the precondition for actual democracy? Like substantive democracy, like Hunter talks about, or Tocqueville, or all that. And why would you think that that would help deal with the problem of growth that like Solo or Kenneth
mm,
Arrow or other people talk about? So you got to go into that, and
mhm,
it's always kind of interesting because a lot of belonging, again, as you know, like I believe there's a form of argumentation that is not simply A leads to B leads to C that leads to
mhm,
D, but overlap. Like
mm,
if these 20 books all say A, there would be very good reason to believe A is true. Maybe it's not,
right.
but if it's in 20 different books, then good reason to think there's something there, right? Now, do
Mm,
those books directly A leads to B leads to C leads to D? No. And then if A is more of a form or
mhm,
an anagon, as we talked about, that's the other thing, the overlap, which I associate with Deleuze as a kind of apprehension of a
mhm,
repeating form. Then there would be reason to think that there's something to that anagon. Anagon is the term
okay,
for what analogical reasoning arrives
okay.
at, and Jockin is very good on this.
Mhm,
But the term anagon, or the fifth, or the thing apprehended, or the insight of Jan Zwiggy, this thing, boom, and you know, now, of course, it could be connections that aren't really there. You might just be a crazy person. But there's this idea of, but that risk is actually necessary. Otherwise, you would have certainty. And that risk is also actually what then puts a challenge on the subject to develop. And that actually gets into some of the
mm,
interpretation stuff from last week. But anyway, all that is to say the topic of, belonging into two. We'll talk a bit at the end about Harold Malwich book, The Emergence of Everything. You get into emergentism. Now, I hesitate to talk about emergentism because that's become a magic word, where if you say, well, there's emergence, and that just kind of, it's almost like a God of the gaps kind of thing.
mm,
But there
mm,
is something that in that original book from the early 2000s, maybe,
mhm.
where he's
What's
talking
his name
about
again?
Malwich, Harold Malwich,
Okay.
Jim Rudd has mentioned him a few times. You could
Yeah.
say this is one of kind of the ground zero thinkers of complexity science, emergent thinking, and he goes through and shows like 20, I think it's 28 examples of emergentism. Now, what an emergence is basically something that cannot be reduced to the initial conditions that generated it. So,
Mm,
like,
mm,
if we're using Bard or Lung's language, like chemistry gives you biology, but biology behaves in a way that is not reducible to chemistry.
mm,
Chemistry behaves in a way that's not reducible to physics. Now, you have this weird question of how exactly does physics give rise to chemistry? Or things like that. We've had a snake in the garage, so we're just waiting for it to kind of come up. It
just
may have
waiting.
run away, but it's a
We'll see.
black snake. It doesn't really matter. Um, and what he'll talk about. at one point is saying something like, reductionism is the opposite of emergentism.
Mhm.
Reductionism is when you arrive at conclusions by basically saying the wholes are the sum of their parts. Wholes are their parts, and that's of course been a very useful method. But then when you start looking at emergentism, you're actually asking, what is the whole what whole does these parts or these pieces generate? Now, technically, in a way, there are no parts anymore. It's just holes generate curving into other holes, gestalts curving into gestalts, as we've said with Seth and Aspasia. But you're actually asking a lot about starting positions.
Mm,
And I guess what I want to get into that is really, really, I think, very important for emergence. The thing that's just really interesting is that the emergence comes from constraint. It's not an addition.
mm,
So there's a constraint that creates. So, and this is, I think, just very, very important. As I understand emergence, it is a result of a constraint, not an addition. So you would think, oh, well, if we go from physics to chemistry, something's been added, right? But actually, something happens in physics where it hits a kind of limit, and that kind of forces the arisal of chemistry. Then chemistry hits a limit, and that forces the arrival of biology. Biology hits a limit, and that gives you mind. Now you would think, oh, it's an addition,
mhm,
but you see, we're having a problem because if we're starting with everything, then what is there to add, right? So there actually has to be in the starting conditions constraints that will give you the emergence, which is then more complexity. But what's interesting about saying more complexity is that would sound like you're adding something. But in a certain way, you're not actually adding, you're creating constraints that generate. There are constraints of which emerge. Like there are constraints that emerge. And like we could say, we could use a lot of examples. For example, we tend to say that water plus sunlight equals steam, if I were to make an example. But in a way, it's actually water in the environment of heat reaches a limit to where it can continue to be water and it becomes steam. So it's not really adding sunlight, in a certain way. It's forcing water to undergo a limit that brings about a transformation. So, in another way, you could say that mammals at some point reached a kind of limit to how much energy they could get from eating plants. And also the difficulty of eating plants was so high. So there was a limit that then forced them to try meat because it brought about more nutrition more effectively, more quickly, right?
mm,
So a limit led to in a sense, limit led to evolution.
mm,
It is not that it's not actually so much that there was an idea, "Oh, let's cook meat. Oh, let's do
mm.
that." No, there was a limit that then
Yeah.
there's responded to that generates something that in a way adds complexity. You could also start getting into the birth of agriculture as an emergent. I know this is but it's very interesting because it's interesting to think emergence as such with the theme of season 2 about freedom in restraint, determination, limitation. If mysterious energy, which we talked about designing areas, actually is kind of working with constraints, all of these things seem to actually kind of align. And if indeed, like I guess I was going to say with agriculture, you could say that there comes to be a certain limit to how complex a people can be and continue to be nomadic. And also, you could say that, evidence, a lot of people argue that agriculture led to religion, but it actually looks like religion leads to agriculture. It's the other way around that, humans were, Homo sapiens, et cetera, were always already religious, which is an interesting idea. But the point would be that the nomadic hit a limit of how they could observe their religion and still be nomadic. There came a point where they needed to be stationary. Well, then, if you're stationary, then you need to feed without traveling, and thus you create agriculture. So the point I'm getting at is that these limits actually create um, emergence. And another way to look at emergence, I suppose, as I understand it, and I'm no expert on the field, is an emergence is something that once it occurs, it kind of changes the rules of behavior. It changes what people do. It changes it like
Possible,
changes
what happens?
possible like once you have agriculture, it then becomes rational to grow food. It becomes the right thing to do. It
Mm,
changes normal behavior you could get into. Like
mm,
once language is created, that changes the norm of
mm,
how humans interact, what they say. Now, I don't want to push that too far, but there's something about an emergence that kind of changes. everything that was up to that point, and it never kind of goes back to the way that it was
Mhm.
before. It's like you've added dye to milk. You can't take it out. You've mixed these things together, and it changes the quality of all the previous emergences as well. Like you could say agriculture after technology, I think he talks about philosophy or religion, is not the same as agriculture before those things. You could say biology is never the same after agriculture than it was before agriculture. There's this top down causation that occurs that changes the meaning of the whole. But what's just very interesting is this would mean that there's something about limit and constraint that is generative. And that's actually like what made the world or is constraints. And these constraints are latent in things. Like there's a constraint in biology that it will run up against eventually. And we can even thank Mr. Ebert's tremendous work in freak theory on saturation. There's a limit that biology will hit that will then give you mind, like mind. And there's then a limit that mind will hit that will give you language. Because there was a time when mind is just, phenomenon, grasped, senses, and then language comes out of that, right? So there are limits that are hit that generate. If that is the case, then if there's something to be said that we're in an age where it's like, what do we do? There's something new that's needed, or people, and to bring this all down to like people's individual lives. This would suggest that if you feel stuck in your life, you need constraints,
Yeah.
you need limits. This would say if the society feels stuck, that it needs limits and that those limits actually create. But here's the issue. How do you choose limits and it not be oppressive? Like,
Mhm.
what would
Yeah.
be the source of limits? Now, that's getting into the topic that gets into the social coordination mechanism and then how that ties with the pricing mechanism, but I guess that's just to start to throw at you. I'd be curious any reactions or
Mhm.
thoughts because a lot of belonging again is ultimately going to have to get into the question of why the social coordination mechanism helps the coordination of limits that are not top down imposed, but nevertheless are real limits that afford emergence and complexity, and therefore surprise, therefore things like beauty, character development that otherwise would not be possible. So there's a coordination of a limit that is not top down, that is actually somehow latent with what it is to be human. That if that is not effectively coordinated into interaction and environments, then you're not going to get emergence of you're not going to get a new address. But let me throw that at you.
That's all wonderful. Um, and there's a lot there. I guess the first thing I'll say is I was thinking of a question right then when you were saying at the end about the coordination of a limit,
Yeah.
because that's interesting to think about limit being like orchestrated, or because it does seem to be that these limits that things run up against are inherent, like
Yep.
like in the sense that it gets to the point where it's passes into the limitation. It's almost like a death that passes into life or something like that, where its inability, or it's what it cannot transfer into or something like that, becomes what births the next thing or something like that. And so now, in a sense, that next thing is related to the prior, and so it does feel like very sublative in that
Yep. Yeah.
regard.
Yeah.
um but it makes me think about this idea of inherent limitation be unfolding.
Yeah.
Like, it makes me wonder if the limitations are going to emerge, thinking about the language of emergence, that it will emerge inherently. Now, I mean, that might seem a little too, because, like, okay, well, if you let's just say you can assume that or something, then that doesn't really, that might be too lax, like in the sense of, well, it will just, it'll
I
just
mean, that's
naturally
actually exactly the problem I'm getting at,
mm,
that I'm
mm,
looking
mm.
toward is what is an
Yeah.
essential limit versus an arbitrary limit?
Well,
Like
right.
a real limit that would afford emergence versus not.
Yeah, because it could come a little too lacking in agency,
Yeah, that's
because
exactly the problem. I guess that's what I'm
yeah.
getting at with a magical form of emergentism. There's a way some people talk about emergentism that is actually in the name of defending the subject, but there's some sort of loss of agency in that defense of the subject
Mhm,
because
mhm,
it kind of is just happening in a certain way. And there's a
mhm.
possible now I'm not accused there's not a particular
Sure,
person I
sure.
have in mind, but it's and maybe that critique is incorrect.
Yeah.
But there is a certain sort of loss of agency in emergentism that in its effort to defend the subject may actually hurt the agent in a certain way.
Yeah, well, because what I'm sensing and gathering is the fact that you could just potentially, and there's something good about, trusting the process or something like that.
Yeah, there's something
But
humble and
there's
there's even
something,
something kind of
no,
noble about
yeah,
trusting, say, this unfolding process in a
yeah,
certain way.
but it could also mean that you're just waiting around.
It could,
Like
absolutely.
in the, not that somebody's actually obviously they're not just going to be sitting waiting, but there can be almost like a metaphysical or a dispositional or on the choice level where they are essentially just kind of waiting around for that next emergence, which
Yes.
unfortunately then it can become emergency. You know,
This is
well
exactly
that
the problem.
yeah.
Because but isn't Hegel, Dylan Shaw is right about Hegel leaving us with a certain reconciling yourself with the movement of Geist in
Guys.
realizing absolute knowing. Isn't that the equivalent, you could argue, in a certain way? Or if you sort of go integration with lack and we have to accept lack, well, is that it? Is there any possibility of improvement or agency
Yeah.
or development, right? But then if you say the strike of beauty, well, where does that come from? What do we do? Are we just waiting around for the strike of beauty? So all of it, because then the question, because here's the issue: the alternative's top down, and you're ignoring Friedrich Hayek. Oh, so we have to engineer it then. Oh, well, if you
Mm,
engineer emergence, you're done. Like if you engineer the strike of beauty, you're done. So we're there.
yeah.
This is the pickle. You either
Mm,
seem like you're. It seems as if now this is what belonging in is all about. Saying there is a middle. There's another way, as you know, but
yeah.
it seems as if you're stuck between waiting around
Hmm.
or top down,
Yeah, top
which
down.
gets you into nudging, which gets you into the state, which gets you into everything the Austrians are warning
Hmm.
against. And I think there's very good evidence to show that doesn't work. Or you're waiting for the AI Chinese model that's going to, actually overcome the coordination problem of von Mises. It seems like we're trapped between those two.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's a false divide, Daniel, because the waiting around and the emergence will get subsumed by whatever powers that be are going to use that nonchalance. If you can say it's a nonchalance, I'm not saying that people actually
Oh
who
no, that's
like a
kind of juvenile. I mean, there's an argument that actually the waiting around is to the benefit of the state.
one thousand
Like that's
percent.
like
That's
arguing the individualism actually benefits the state
one
because
thousand
there's no
percent.
collective action to stop the logic of capital. That's like a Karatani kind of point. So yeah, I think you're right. It's easily a false choice.
Yeah, well, in the sense that the two essentially like feed into one another. The two feed into one another. So or could potentially feed into to one another because again if and that's a big if because I'm sure there are people in the emergence world who are very much have maybe considered that.
I'm not making any critique against any particular emergent person because
Mm.
there's a bad form of emergence, there's a bad form of Hegelianism, bad form of beauty, bad form of everything. Like
Yeah.
any movement you want
Mhm.
to defend has a bad form of it.
Yeah. Well, and I'll say this too, like I think that the
Christianity, atheism, I mean, we can play this game.
yeah. Yeah, and actually that emergency wordplay is something that I learned from like people in the birth world
Mm.
because and that's why I think actually if we I did already bring up birth already, but I think that could be a very good locus for considering this as an analogy because the stakes are real for the birthing woman and in the sense that it is her actual involvement, her body, her process, and but she also had to be open to an inception, if you will, the conception.
It's very
Like,
interesting because it makes me think of Zizek's kind of emergency capitalism, where his kind of
mm,
political project is a bit of you wait for the emergencies in capitalism, and this
mhm,
opens a space where new possibility can occur. So there are many thinkers who kind of have this idea that the emergency is the event and kind of event in a loaded term. It's interesting to think of that with birth.
yeah. Well, the distinction there that is often, or why they're bringing attention to those words, is because there's a lot of assumptions about the top-down emergency framework that it should be handled with,
Mm,
uh, versus an emergence, which is the total human agency in that receptivity to a
mm.
choice and to an actual uh, limitation that then
Yes.
brings forth the new life, the new thing,
Sure,
the
and I
new.
should clarify, there's an idea in the Zizek, as I understand it, that the emergency actually is the opportunity for, dare I say, an event or emergence. Event and emergence are different, but they kind of go together. And there's a way that therefore you should see the emergency as an opportunity. And if you,
Mm,
and I guess what I want to say is what I was thinking is if you view, say, the labor as an emergency, you act in a top-down way that is
yes.
problematic,
Yes.
as opposed to seeing the pressure as
As emergent.
actually properly being responded to with a certain actually trust of the body, waiting and giving
Yes.
over to the
Yes.
emergence. So please,
Well, yeah, and I think, yeah, I mean, and I think there could be some fine tuning there, like, because again, the Zizekian point you just brought
emergency
up,
capitalism kind of thing.
there's maybe a way in which, like, let's resurrect the concept of emergency. Uh, so yeah, in a sense, it's an emerging like it's a type of word where we could blend the two, where you
Mm,
could kind of see them as related to one another, and they clearly are. But you know, the risk with just kind of waiting on the emergency is that you forget your full participation
yeah,
in the
you forget
emergence.
your
And then
participation.
the other side of it, which is this emergence, which is waiting around, is that you never let yourself be impregnated with what's going to
Correct,
change you,
correct,
like which is
correct.
going to cost you in the sense that it's going to require something of you. It's going to be the sacrifice, and that in that sense a cost, but it's also your cost is your gain in the
Yes,
sense that like your cost is also the gaining of new life, transformation. Nothing will be the same again after that type of experience. Nothing's the same again after that new life is brought into the world. Nothing is the same again after you allow yourself to be the portal of
right.
emergence. So like it's so I don't know. I don't want to just leave it as the word embodied, but it's so much you having a stake in it. Whereas with emergence that's waiting around, you could just kind of be like potentially, this is the, again, this is maybe a bad version of it that maybe doesn't even exist out there in the
Sure, sure,
literature,
sure.
but a risk for it, which we can do as humans, is just to let the emergence be, uh I'll go with the flow, but I'm also not going to actually be fully open to the stakes of it. and and
Yes,
then you just wait around for the emergency to tell you what
yes,
is the new thing to come forth.
yes,
And that the problem there is that you might be very susceptible to a top down thing. And the weird thing is that like the concept of birth feels, because it's so fraught with like, um oh well, that's top down anyway, to let your body be the basically the deciding factor of your limitation, right? But there, and it could be steeped with like traditionalism and like, oh, you have to do this and your only worth is in
yeah,
this.
sure.
So yes, of course I understand it's fraught with all of that, but when it comes to becoming like, and that's why in a way, in a sense, we have an interesting opportunity as humans for it to be a choice, though maybe arguably it has always been somewhat a choice to a degree in the past. But the point of the matter is, it's a unique choice given technological essences that impede upon
Yes,
the person's choice, or bringing it to bear as a choice or something like that. The fact of the matter is that in that choice, it's a full yielding to a limitation
yeah,
that then can bring forth the new paradigm or something
yes,
like that.
yes,
And so yeah, I just there is something really really interesting there. And also it does make me think about just how, I don't know, almost allergic we've become, or possibly allergic to that, because again, stakes feel scary and risky, and and I don't know about all that. And why does it have to be that way anyway? And that's the thing, it doesn't have to be that way. This is why the absolute choice comes into it. It's not, doesn't have to be that way. In a sense, it's just that I guess I want to say that for me, an emergence that doesn't involve your skin in the game is possibly a lax position that could leave you dodging responsibility. I mean,
yes,
for or just waiting around for, well, that is a dodging responsibility, just kind of being jerked around by the emergency that is defined by the state or this person or that person who's going to then make decisions for you. And that's the thing, like you're inherently going to hit these like limits anyway, in the sense that, you know I guess what I'm trying to say is like, for the person who says, oh, I don't want my body to be the limitation for what I do, right? Or
sure,
then that's fine, except that you have to acknowledge that you're still acquiescing to some sort of decision making that other people will do
sure,
for you, and
sure.
that could also just be the zeitgeist or whatever it is. So um yeah, and maybe one could be like, well, how do you ever make an actual choice for yourself then? I mean, it's a big it does maybe bear that question, but I think that perhaps the best that one can do is just like a choice in awareness and the recognition that you are accepting a certain chain, if you will, like in the Nietzschean sense, right?
Yes, yes.
So, anyways, I'll throw
Well,
it back to you. There's a lot
there's
there.
a tension here between, because if you say we're not just going to wait around, then you're going to do politics and passing laws and
Mm.
power, and
The
isn't that,
action. Mm,
isn't that a problem? But if you do waiting around or something that sounds like waiting around, isn't that quietism? Where you're just accepting the zeitgeist or whatever the state,
mm,
whatever horrors the state is doing, right? So there's this major tension here, right? Um, why is faithful presence, as we talk about in Belonging Again, in light of Hunter's work, not mere quietism? Quietism meaning basically you just kind of stand to the side and don't do anything,
mm.
right? And you say, well, all we can do is wait for the event. Wait. And again, it's interesting to think, I'm not sure what exactly perhaps would be the differences between an event in the Badiou
Yeah,
Zizek
yeah.
sense or in the continental tradition, Heidegger, versus an emergence. It
Mm.
would be interesting to think those together. Maybe practically there is no difference. I'm not sure. But the key that for me is just very important, as I understand what Harold Mount, what he's writing about in the Theory of Everything, is that emergence is afforded by encountering limit or constraint.
What was that first part?
Limit or constraint.
What's it before that?
Encountering limit or constraint. Like emergence is
Mhm,
afforded
mhm.
by that.
Yeah.
The reason why that is a very big deal is because if emergence creates complexity,
Yes.
the opposite of complexity is more like equilibrium, flatness,
Yeah.
one dimensionality. And there's something about that of which is entropic. It's just kind of death, it's just kind of emptiness. Now, the point should be made, though, that as I understand, and I think Jim Rudd has made this point with Alex Ebert, is that complexity actually emerges from an acceleration of entropy. It's
Mm,
not necessarily the opposite of entropy. And actually, you could argue
mm,
negentropy is when you have a localized acceleration of entropy that actually gives you a burst of workable energy. And entropy is just energy you can't use anymore. But it would seem as if various accelerations of entropy can generate negentropy. But
mm,
actually, this is because you've accelerated entropy, so it's not violating entropy.
mm,
Now, that opens a million, there's actually a million things to get into there. And whether it be Sand Talk with Tyson or others who talk about we need to, or Paul Krappel, there are many thinkers that want to get into that debate. But the point is
mm,
that um, complexity seems to require constraint. And part of the book talks about how a way that scientists, as I understand it, will deal with problems that are too large to compute. Like it's too large to compute. You don't actually have to give up on those problems. What you can do is change the initial starting positions to actually see various trajectories that could arise out of those computations. So even though you can't name all possible states, you can get an insight to what starting conditions afford what possible states versus others.
mm,
And so you can make meaningful conclusions about that which you cannot predict or make calculations about by having different variations of starting positions. But every starting position is a different constraint,
mm,
actually, is a
mm,
different limitation. So the reason why all of that is very important is because then the loss, here's the weird thing, the loss of constraint in some sense is a loss of complexity.
mm,
It's a
mm, mm,
loss of life in
mm,
negentropy in a certain way. So
mm,
what this would mean is that the answer to life, to the generation of new energy and everything, can't be the removal of constraint. But that would mean you have to encounter constraint, and how do you determine what constraint to
yeah,
encounter in what way,
exactly.
right? What the argument that wants to be made is that the social coordination mechanism is in the same way that Hayek's pricing mechanism is a testing of market dynamics. Which hammer is most valuable, which is most useful in coordinating. Like it's an endless test, as Dietrich McCloskey would say. There is something about the social coordination mechanism where people are encountering one another online that is actually testing limits
Mm,
to actually encounter limits. And if you don't encounter limits, then you don't get complexity. And let's make an example of this. An obvious example would be if, say, the Christian online encounters the atheists or the Muslim or different people who there's a debate between one, or Christians who have different views, the constraint of the other person not agreeing with you. Like they have a different view from you. So that kind of is a constraint on what you can say that would just kind of pass over the other person. There's a constraint on what you can say and in a sense get away with.
Mm,
Or that actually can force you to think thoughts you otherwise would never think. Right? To actually say, well, is that actually, I know there are people on the TLC that will argue against the Trinity. There are people that will argue for it, and that can ask the question: Is the Trinity essential to Christianity
mhm,
or not? And
mhm,
you may never even ask that question otherwise. Now, maybe you end up in heresy, but the point is, you will actually consider: Is that necessary for Christianity? Is there a limit to what I can think as a Christian and still be a Christian?
mm,
Like, is it possible to not believe in the Trinity and still be a Christian? Do you
mm.
see what I'm saying?
Oh
Or
yeah.
is that a necessary limit to thought?
Mm,
Is it essential or not?
yeah.
The very consideration of that will make you think thoughts you otherwise never would. It may create a form of Christianity that actually is perhaps more beautiful and more fuller because you encounter those limits, right? Now, apply that to economic issues, entrepreneurial possibilities,
Mm,
and everything on the social coordination. And what we might be seeing here is a certain coordination of limit that has never been possible before in history because the geographical travel demands, logistical demands were too high. And we talk about that all the time in Belonging. And you just could not say when you had 30 minutes between dinner and going to bed or work, jump on a call and encounter people who would make you face these limits in a way that was not top down, but that was encountered and personal, that then you could dwell in at a rate that you could handle in the way you could handle. There's way more to be said, but I've been thinking about the social coordination mechanism.
mm,
The thing that the new address will get into is thinking of the social coordination mechanism having something to do with effective coordination of encountering limit constraints to afford complexity that would not occur otherwise,
mm,
and simultaneously the development of persons and people who can handle that complexity or
mm,
think that
mm,
complexity, which if
mm,
we cannot do, global pluralism destroys us.
mm,
Because there's also, there's also a way in which um, emergence and in responses to constraints are also necessary for survival. And it's not mere survival, but let's go back to the eating meat example. There's a way in which there's a limit to how long you can survive and live this way and not eat meat. You need more efficient calories or you're gonna die, given the geography, right? So there's something about the constraint being I almost want to say a feng noumenon in the kind of Landian sense, as
mm,
Downs talks about, but that might be too much, where it's also a matter of survival. So if global pluralism is a constraint that we have to become more complex to survive, if we don't do it, then global pluralism will existentially overwhelm us and will be destroyed. But that means it requires the individual subject to encounter constraint that then allows them to become more complex.
mm,
That could say surprise them with something inside of themselves, dare
mm.
I say, even emerge to something inside of
Yeah,
themselves
yeah.
that actually equips them to handle that complexity. But let me throw it to
Mm.
you on anything.
No, that's all good. And that last point, I was thinking about that earlier, right? This development of the subjectivity to encounter limit, of course.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's to me, it almost feels like the social coordination mechanism is not necessarily coordinating like, okay, 1, 2, 3, hit it. Now we've got our
Yeah.
limit, like coordinating it in that regard. But it's
Right.
more like it's weird because it's actually an expansion of possibility
Yes.
that then actually test like
Yes.
you come up against limits
Is
a
an
lot.
expansion of a field that has you encountering
Yeah,
limit.
and
Yeah.
actually, that it's interesting how you were saying, like, kind of laying the foundation in the earlier in the conversation about this actually being like a subtraction
Yes.
that then leads to
That's the
like it's
weird thing. It's a
yeah, it's like
subtraction that makes complexity.
yeah, it's kind of like it's actually something that literally is there's like a yeah, there's something that's undone or something
Yes.
like that, but so that you can get to the fullness
Yes.
of more or
Yes.
multiplicity or
Yes.
complexity or
Yes.
yeah, more
Yes.
life, all of that.
And this points to religions talking about sin as excess that holds you back. And there's this
Hmm.
weird way that saints and whatever limit to become
Hmm.
more beautiful.
Hmm.
Like you kind of see this in
Hmm.
many religious
Yeah.
traditions.
Because it's a funny way in which, like, even to say that, like, there's a so the internet, okay, so most people think of it as like the world wide web, right? It's like this opening, this like
Yes.
this.
Yes.
But what's funny is that it actually is it it's
It's
kind
made
of
us Hick and Maury in a weird way.
well, yeah, yeah, it's like the world wide web. Nobody's leaving their
Yes.
house or their own like their own sort of
Yeah.
ideology or whatever it is.
Yes.
But it also affords that constraint, which we sometimes just think of as a freedom. It's actually is a kind of constraint
Yes.
because and it does constrain people. Look at the way people can feel constrained to the device or their time or oh well, like this is whatever it is. So basically what I'm trying to say is that um the constraint. So first of all, that just is interesting to me. Thinking about the things we think of as like the freedom, right? And we've
Yes.
talked about this a lot with freedom, apart from choice, commitment, etc. Like that ends up being like the opposite. So again, the thing that's supposed to be the World Wide Web, this all this openness, da da da, is actually like actually presents a kind of constraint because now in light of that, you you almost feel like subtracted from your givenness, right? Too, because you're suddenly encountering like so much difference and all these opinions and all this stuff going on all over the place and stuff. So you kind of feel like subtracted from your own reality, or you
Yes.
can. But the point of the matter is, you could also kind of push further into that or through that to get to the place where that constraint becomes the fertile ground for encountering again
Yeah.
limitations so that you expand in your
Yes.
own reality, your own life, your own work, your own self, your own personhood, so that again you are more capable of again encountering um difference, and and then also affording more complexity, like you're saying. And I guess I'm just thinking about this as it relates to, like, I don't know why, but for some reason I'm thinking about like nervous system, like the
Yeah.
nervous system, like we've talked about, like, do you have the nervous system to be able to encounter limitation
Yes.
via social coordination mechanism, internet, da da da. And why it relates to me on what I was saying about birth and emergence versus emergency is like, I think a lot of people go into fight or flight, even when it comes to online engagement, because it's affronting, right? Or
Yeah.
it's like um, there's kind of like the people just like attack each other, or
Yep.
like they, it's like the keyboard warriors or whatever they say. Like there's a lot of people, or like they're kind of in their zone, or to avoid that, they just stay in their zone or their lane of like, that's what we think and this is what we think, and anything else is just bad or wrong, or we can't hear that side. So guess what I mean to say is that to me, this process of like allowing birth to be like this very natural process of all that it entails is like to allow the encountering of the limitation and seeing that as actually the avenue for expansion,
Yes.
instead of it jumping to a panic mode of like, this is panicky. And because the panicky side of it is just going to be, it actually shuts down expansion, and it shuts down the very process by which you need to go through for the emergence to
Right.
occur. So um yeah, I think that, I guess I'm just making like a parallel where like the emergency can be a lot of like intervening in each
Yes.
other's lives, interventional,
Yes.
like this hyper kind of vigilance on, like, almost surveilling other people, and then feeling like we can, because that's the other thing. I think people think, well, I am encountering limitation because I see something and this is how I'm going to respond. And this is why when we talk about the like this there's like this healthy level of waiting, like this waiting around, like we're talking about the
Yes.
merchant, you actually should think about like what you are doing and how, and your action and your words and what you're going to interject and intervene and intervention with,
Yes.
as like, wait, so your doing is different than the way we typically think about doing. When we talk about not just sitting around, it's this kind of like active like cultivation of the
Yes.
subjectivity, which means again you allow encountering difference, encountering limitation, figuring out how to get calm
Yes.
enough to be able to do that and not be freaking
Yes.
out in this
Yes.
emergency way. You allow for the emergence to happen, the birth to happen, the process to happen, the unfolding, the expansion, and allowing it. And that is actually not like when you're doing this motive, well, I am doing that because I'm saying this to this other person online, behind, essentially behind a screen, right? That, to me, the reason why that is um not in the spirit of like encountering limit is because it's doing too much to try and change things out there for somebody else without
Yes.
perhaps sitting with that uncomfortable feeling of what, maybe is true, maybe isn't, that you then allow to change yourself and become and present and carry yourself then differently in that space of limitation via the social coordination mechanism.
Yes. I mean,
Does that make
that is the ultimate absolute choice, is limit that. Our question today is how we are going to quote unquote be unlimited. Are we unlimited by erasing limit? Thus, erasing the person that disagrees with you. Because when you're the keyboard warrior, you're basically saying that person is wrong. There's nothing to learn from them. They need to be corrected. So they're not a limit. Like, they're not a true limit. They're a difference, but not an essential like limit. That's when you get into internally consistent systems. So there's a few things here. Like, are we have to choose on if we think the unlimited is a result of removing limit, or if the unlimited is found in limit. that actually it is encountering limit that in a sense makes us unlimited, and that what is unlimited, you could say, is the unfolding, is this emergence, is this
Mhm.
building complexity.
Mhm.
But then like is this kind of encounter with the movement of absolute knowing, and these things are all different, but there is these interesting
Overlaps.
overlaps
Yeah,
that
yeah.
we have to get into. um the thing that seems to be very important with Hegel is the stress on absolute knowing, as Zizek puts it, and I believe he is correct, as this encounter of limit.
Mm.
It would seem as if, for one to talk of emergence without an encounter of limit, would be removing the constraints that make emergence occur. And
Exactly.
now we have something dangerous. So there's something about what Zizek is talking about, or Lacan or the psycho, where it says all of these are tied to some sort of encountering limit, encountering lack,
Mhm.
integrating with lack. That is, to me, getting at the constraint that, if not accepted, means you're not getting complexity. And yet, very often, people that will talk about complexity or emergency or emergence will not want anything to do with psychoanalysis. But then the psychoanalytical Zizekian people don't like the emergentism stuff, and
Yeah.
the complexity stuff, and understandably, because it's all ground zero of kind of the major problem. What is the quality of the weighting that
Good call.
encounters limit?
Yep.
And how do we determine the limit that we need to encounter? Because again, when you go to the keyboard, like when you go to the keyboard warrior, you are saying that your view of the world, let's say it's conservatism, it's actually not limited. It has all the answers. And the person who disagrees with you, there's basically three options, as Kathy Schwartz put it in her incredible book, Being Wrong. They're either stupid, they're ignorant, meaning no, they're stupid, meaning they can't get the truth. They're ignorant, meaning they've never been told the truth, or they're evil. They know the truth and they don't want it. Those are the only three options. But if there are axiomatic differences, meaning that people can be rational and wrong, or you can have, like, if there are three sets of axioms, every person relative to those axioms is rational and right, and so they're not wrong because they don't accept your axioms. You see what I'm saying? Like, if you accept an axiomatic claim such as free markets are the most efficient, or something like that, and the reason why that's axiomatic is because you probably have never observed it. It's a assumption based on your understanding of the theory that everything would work without state intervention. But then someone like Cornel West would point out, it's like, well, there's never been a free market. So even though technically it would work if the market was free, practically it never manifests because of big banks or corporations or special interest groups, and the routes are all sense. So what ends up happening is, yes, it is true that if markets were free and actually stayed free and never became mixed, then it would be the best system. But someone who doesn't accept the very possibility of those conditions ever arising could be completely rational, but you would just say, well, they're just stupid and wrong. You see what I'm trying to get at? So that's the problem of internally consistent systems. The thing I want to argue, though, is that internally consistent systems themselves are constraints that actually, if let's put it this way, it would seem in order to get complexity or emergence or possibility, which seems extremely important in a world where economic stagnation seems to be setting it, political, like you're looking for a new possibility, right? So how do you get new possibility? A new possibility has to be surprising. It has to be something that doesn't occur, that you don't expect.
Mm.
And yet it happens, because if you could think of it, then it would be done. Or here's the problem, if you can think of it, it can be engineered. And if it can be engineered, then and our problem is engineering. Like, then that's not gonna work. So that's actually
And it
really
risks the
important.
top down.
Yeah. So Ivan Illich and Brian made this point in Theory Underground,
Mm.
and this is a good way to think of, like, the main problem Illich is pointing to. Illich basically wants to say all our problems today are in a sense due to planning.
Mm.
And if you say, well, Illich, what are we supposed to do? He's like, well, I can't tell you without making a plan. So you're like, oh, I guess we're screwed. In the same way that it's like, if our problems is technological essence,
Mhm.
and how are you gonna engineer away the problem of technological essence when that is engineering? So you need a
Yeah,
different kind of action.
exactly.
If the problem is planning, you can't plan. You have to address the problems of planning with not planning, which is preparing. But how do you prepare? And what
Yes.
way do you prepare? This basically the answer that would mean what Ivan Illich is pointing to is something like an emergence, something that is not planned, that occurs, that deals with the problem of planning, in the, but was not itself planned. It arose because of the conditions you created. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Mm.
What it seems to me, as I understand, two main features of increasing the probability of an emergence which I'm going to say the surprising new, seems to be basically, in a sense, flow in a Deleuzian sense and constraint. So ease of movement, ease of interaction,
Mhm.
lowering the transaction cost of encounter,
Yes.
and constraint.
Mhm.
So for most of history, the logistical demands of, say, um, in a Muslim encountering a Christian, or someone really good in Hegel encountering someone really good in Deleuze, was extremely high. So it didn't happen very much, except at conferences. But then, as of like 10 years ago, we started to get the social coordination mechanism with faster internet, Zoom, and whatever. So now it's much easier for
Yeah.
those people. So the flow is increased. Okay.
Yeah.
But each one of those people represent a set of constraints. Okay. So they are bound to their constraints. I believe in Hegel or I believe in Christianity, but you're encountering a difference that then encountering the limit of the other makes you think about your Hegel or your psychoanalysis or Christian or whatever in ways you otherwise would never
Yeah.
encounter.
Yeah.
So every map, every internally consistent system, and it's important it's internally consistent. That means you cannot by your own rationality deconstruct it,
Yeah.
right? So that is a constraint. I guess what I want to argue, and I know that's a lot, I'll throw it at you, is that a lot of the talk on perennialism or even emergentism is about kind of we're going to overcome our individual religions and kind of think about emergentism. We're going to and even, I mean, even Harold at the end of his book is kind of suggesting that religions need to rethink themselves in light of emergentism. That emergentism is, in a sense, the spiritual motion movement that all religions are pointing to. And so, in that sense, perennialism, like emergentism, is being presented as a kind of perennialism.
Mhm.
And as I understand his work, I think Brendan, basically
Mhm.
Graham Dempsey, points in that direction, and there seems to be truth to this. There seems to be something about emergentism that religions need. Yes.
Yes.
But then there's a form of basically observing the emergentism over the constraint of your religion. What I am suggesting is that the emergentism must come within the constraints of your religion. You must be totally all in on, say, Islam, totally all in on, say, Christianity, and encounter the difference that then makes something emerge in your map, internally
Mhm.
consistent
Mhm.
system, from the girdle point, ultimately, the
Yeah.
incompleteness, that would not emerge otherwise. So the
Mhm.
claim would be whatever is good, true, and beautiful about atheism, Christianity, Islam, etc., Hinduism, is going to more so be true, good, and beautiful in the social coordination mechanism because of it than it would be without of it, because of the flow and because
Mhm.
of the encounters. And that logic then applies to every single individual life. Every single individual life in their own unique constraints of whatever they are. Born in Virginia on a farm, born in New York household, born here, there, like whatever constraints every single possible individual has on planet Earth, to the degree that they increase encounter flow, that actually is going to afford more beauty than would be possible otherwise. But that could also destroy them because rising complexity, if it overwhelms the subject, is Lovecraftian and can be destroyed, right? Because that's the other problem with emergentism. Like if you're not, you like when the water turns to steam, there's a death. Like when the constraints are saturated, there's a kind of death. Ebert will talk about this, and a lot of what we're saying today is has Ebert's work kind of all over it. And so there's a death here that has to be suffered. But on the other side of it is beauty that can't happen otherwise. And you could say that global pluralism, which is a constraint, you're no longer able to have the Christianity unaware of the other. You're no longer able to have the Hinduism with givens or whatever. So there's a constraint now, and that constraint makes possible beauty, goodness, and truth and character that couldn't happen otherwise. But it also brings with it a death, a challenge, something very, very difficult, right? But so then we have to train people to be able to handle that. But let me stop and throw it to you.
Well, and it's funny because that death though is new life for
Yes.
Christianity, psychoanalysis for
Yes.
like it's Islam. Like it's actually bringing like it makes me think. Is it is it C.S. Lewis? Is it C.S. Lewis? There's somebody who says like about this idea of like in basically in the sanctification process or in like there's almost something about like blue being more blue.
Oh yeah, Lewis at the end of Narnia.
Okay,
Kind of
yeah,
like New
yeah,
Jerusalem
yeah.
is where blue is more
More
like
like
blue,
blue.
trees are more like trees, everything. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So
Things
then
are more like
things
themselves.
are more like themselves, and that's the hard thing to wrap our minds around of this idea that perhaps actually it's not because I think that people think about that in terms of just buttressing and making a fortress
Yes.
of their thing, right?
Yes. Yes.
And that's what's going to make it more like blue. Blue is more
Yes.
like blue. If
Yes.
we just
Yes.
get really really
Adamant.
adamant about it,
Yes, yes,
and
yes,
the irony is that actually in the softening, in the ability to allow, in the ability to be what you are and encounter otherness and be open to what that may have to say
yes,
to you, for you, and what you may have to offer as well, that actually could make you in your you-ness more
yes,
of yourself,
yes.
like more of who you
I
are.
mean, all the
So
political options and religious options are relations with the question of limits. So you have, like, basically, also to be noted, for me, the pricing mechanism is effective at coordinating scarce resources, but you need this, but it's not good at coordinating excesses and qualities, and that's what the social coordination mechanism. That's a huge thing, but social coordination mechanism effectively coordinates excess. But the thing I was going to say is, it all comes down to, we have to make the absolute choice on how we're going to relate to limit, because when the Christian says fortress, this is Christianity, and we're accepting limit. This is our limit. That's not a limit, because everything outside doesn't exist in a way. So there's no limit to you. You're
mm,
defining reality as inside, and everything beyond the limit is nothing. Okay?
mm,
But so the only way to have a limit is if you have difference that you really are constrained by, you give yourself over to, and you encounter the other. You have to encounter the other. So you need flow and movement. If and the claim is that basically, without limit, Christianity can only be the fullness of Christianity with limit, not with a fortress that makes everything outside false. That's when it entropies and dies, because there's no constraint for complexity. Nor can you have complexity if Christianity uses the state, or any religion uses the state, to top down decide what is the better world, if you will. The more Christian Christianity has to emerge from the combination of the constraint, giving itself over to what it is, and encountering otherness. And in that encounter, things arise that otherwise would not arise. And this is ground zero for every economic, political, and social, like, question that we have to deal with. It's all going to come down to a question of how we relate to limit,
mm.
and what we do with limit. And if we think the name of the game is to remove limit, to make everything beyond the limit not exist, so the limit's not even a limit, it's just the boundary of the cosmos, or if limit is what we want to encounter one another so that things can emerge that otherwise could not emerge. This is the final absolute choice realm.
Yeah, that's all fantastic. I guess it made me think about, could we say there's a distinction almost, but then between constraint and limit? Because like if we do this buttressing and fortressing of the ideology and saying, but that's my limit, that's actually your constraint. But you encounter limit,
It's a very
like
tricky thing, because there's a
yeah.
way in which, when the Christian makes a fortress, it's not even really a constraint or limit. Everything else outside of it doesn't really exist. There's nothing to constrain. Like, everything is it's actually a univocal move. What you're saying is that, the atheist is actually, in a sense, Christian and doesn't know it.
Hmm.
So there really isn't a difference, because you define all difference in light of your worldview.
I think that's an important point too, though, because like, w- um, how do I put this? Because like, if we don't have that understanding parsed out in our brains, then we can only think of other people's thing as like as their constraint slash limit,
Yes.
and then we start to like assess them as all these
Yes.
things, like all these
Yes.
like these
Yes. Yes.
assessments get put on Christians or whoever, right? Like the person who has some ideology, and yet like actually within that they are actually claiming that this is like, no, this is my freedom,
Yes.
this is my freedom, this
Yes.
is not a
Yes.
constraint to me
Yes.
because I,
Yes.
and in a sense like there's some truth to that, like because it has to be that way, like that has to be your world, and that has to be like what, and
The incredibly difficult thing to
it's a
think
weird thing to
the
think.
very incredibly difficult thing to think is to realize that the atheist in Christianity, like in the world of the Christian, is different from the atheist in the world of atheism. And when you encounter the atheism, what you tend to do is think of the atheist in Christianity, as opposed to realize that the atheist is in atheism. Right. And so you have to, in order to encounter them, and not just talk past one another, you have to do a weird thing where you don't think of them as the atheist or the communist or the capitalist or
Yeah.
whatever within your worldview, but within theirs. And here's the thing, you could argue that's literally impossible to do without just encountering surprise, regular training, every single day interactions. Like, it's actually not possible to do without constant regular interaction, which was not possible before the social coordination mechanism. So it's an incredibly tricky thing.
Yeah, and also I guess I just want to say like the term often gets kind of like lands in the psychoanalytic, but Christians often think that atheists are repressed because they don't have an access to
Yeah, God.
God.
Yeah,
So like
right.
that's the most repressed thing, right? Like
Yes,
you have no
yes, and
access to that, to the infinite
yes,
source of life. So
yes.
like you are repressed. So I guess I'm
But the
just
psychoanalytic thinks the Christians repress because they depend on God, and God tells them what to do, big other, and all that other stuff.
absolutely, yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. So like, but it's important. It's important to even acknowledge that because
And then the
it
Christian tends to go, well, the atheist is wrong. And the atheist says, well, the Christian is
is
wrong
wrong,
about atheism. But
right?
the
It's
real
not.
trick is to encounter the Christian as an atheist or vice versa,
Mhm.
thinking of yourself in light of what they think of you, as opposed of what you think of them.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you say they think I'm
I'm
repressed
repressed.
by the big other, and
Yeah,
according to their worldview, that makes sense. I can see why they would think that. So
exactly.
let me speak from that place and actually test myself to see maybe that is true, though. So
Mhm.
let me actually
Yeah,
test myself from that place. So
yeah,
you've set a constraint on yourself.
yeah.
Now complexity can happen because you've
Yes,
accepted. So
exactly.
let me put it this way: in the encounter, you are to accept the constraint of the other. The other's view of you is the constraint you take upon yourself and see how you develop within it.
Mm,
And complexity only occurs within constraint.
mm,
So
mm,
instead of seeing you empathize with the other to get us to kind of grasp the constraint that you then impose on yourself for
mhm.
your own complexification.
Mhm. And that's why, like, I don't mean to. Of course, it's not a one to one, but the analogy of inception conception
Yes,
is so important
yes,
because you actually have to be the fertile ground for receiving that which will germinate. Like you're germinating, and you're actually going to be transformed in that process. Like you have to
yes,
basically allow yourself to undergo a transformation by receiving what
yes.
was said as if it is life, as if it is truth, right? As if it is the case. So but then you do this quiet work of sitting with that and allowing yourself to grow this new life that is going to come forth from you, that is going to change everything, and it will never be the way it was before, because you
Absolutely.
allowed yourself to do that work of um and see, but that's different actually than just assuming the judgment,
Yes, very different.
because assuming the judgment it isn't to actually allow anything new to come forth
No,
from that.
no, no, no,
You
no.
just took the judgment. It's not.
It's finished. It's done.
Yeah, yeah,
It's not a
exactly. There's
yes,
nothing to work with. It just
yes,
is the case,
yes, yes,
And so in terms of complexity,
yes.
that's where you're going to have to allow, this work of the gestational, that then is going to change you.
Yeah, and a judgment's a conclusion. And that's the opposite of emergentism because you can't know the conclusion in
Yeah,
emergent.
exactly.
You can only accept the constraints.
Hmm.
So you want to accept the constraints of the other
Hmm.
upon yourself, not the conclusions of the
Hmm.
other
Hmm.
upon yourself. Because
Hmm.
the conclusions means there's no emergency. You've reached the end. The constraint is what will challenge you. And I guess so here's I mean the catch-22 is this. You need constraint. And I am basically suggesting that what is being described on a larger scale with emergence and complexity science actually has practical implications for the individual, that the
Hmm.
individual should actually live aligned with that. Um,
With emergence.
with emergence, with the idea that constraint is what complexifies you, limit is what
Hmm.
complexifies you. Like
Hmm.
that is what creates, in a sense, the weird thing is limit makes the infinite.
Yeah.
Like limit makes you infinite,
Yep.
not removing limit. But that gets into the larger question of our moment with AI and everything. But because the technological essence is the idea that the removal of limit creates the unlimited, whereas what is human is basically the faith that tearing with limitation and some sort of acceptance of limitation is what actually makes us fully human.
Yes.
Like things are more like themselves because they are limited, not because they are free of limit.
Yeah.
But then, of course, the question is, well, how do you determine a real limit versus a false limit? Because you could always say, well, I'll be limited by walking around on my knees or stuff like that. And this gets
What I
into
was
where
saying,
you need a
yeah.
perpetual testing mechanism of the social coordination mechanism, the same way you've needed a perpetual testing mechanism of the
Mm,
market
mm,
to determine products. We have not had a social coordination testing mechanism to determine what limits are needed for humanity and what limits can be removed without us losing our humanity at the
mm,
same time.
mm,
And there is an experimentation and nobody knows the answer ahead of time. So we have to test every possible set of constraints as much as we possibly can to see what things can be, things to those tests of constraint that otherwise they could not be at all. But the $1 million catch 22 that I was going to point to and then I'll throw to you is you cannot complexify and I would say develop virtue, character, childhood, all of those align here without constraint. But here's the problem you can't pick your own constraint because if you pick it, it's not a constraint. Like your constraint has to be revealed to you.
Mhm.
Your constraint has to be, in a sense, received. You know how you were talking about with the inception, that something has to be received for you to get the constraint. The other is how you receive a constraint because they give it to you. And then also when we're talking about like designing the room, so a mysterious energy, what you're doing is saying the room has to give me. I have to receive the, and I would say the mysterious energy we've been talking about in season 2 is evidence of complexity. It's an
Yeah.
evidence of
Yeah.
emergency. You can't prove it,
Emergence. Yep.
but it is a sense, like we've been talking about in season 2, some sort of gaining of a capacity to sense emergence, sense life, sense creativity, sense
Yeah.
unfolding,
Yeah.
sense
Sense something
something
coming
happening
happening.
that's not planned. Like you're sensing it
Yeah.
in the air. Something is happening, a complexity is happening, something is happening that is beyond what was planned
Mhm.
or was able to be arranged, and it is more received, right? We're basically saying that you must live your life as much as possible to receive from what is outside of yourself because that is the only way to get real constraint that can really complexify you, really sanctify you, really lead to beauty. And so you have to, the question is how to, so so then when we go, are you waiting or not waiting? Are you active? You're not, you're very active in what seems to be, let's put it, and I'll tell you, what seems to be waiting is where you are being extremely active about living your life in a way to increase the probability of receiving constraints that can complexify you as much as possible. And you're being incredibly intentional about that. Um,
Sorry, can you say that one more time?
you in the what looks like waiting, what you're doing is being incredibly intentional
Mhm.
about living a life where you can receive
Mhm.
constraints
Yes.
to
Yes.
complexify you with as much as possible. Because you can't choose constraints. You can't decide your constraints. And furthermore, other people can't decide your constraints. Like if people come up to you and say, I've got constraints that I think you need, that's not going to work because that's engineered. The constraints have to surprise both of you. The constraints have to emerge between you, right? Like the constraints have to kind of unveil themselves in the relationship and interaction through time more and more as it becomes more real. And that actually is what then gives it complexity. But let me stop and give it to you.
Well, that's all very good. A couple things were coming to mind. I mean, yeah, it's very tricky because like
Yes.
the waiting, like couldn't somebody say, but isn't that just waiting around, like
It seems like it. Yes.
for the constraint to unfold and
Yes.
present itself to me for me to be
Yes.
able to receive it. So
But you're actively looking for limits. The issue is you are actively
opening yourself up.
opening yourself up for encounters, for encountering. That's why the social coordination mechanism is like huge. Like, because if you're going to say the state cannot do the work of basically restoring growth, dealing global pluralism. There has to be what I'm going to argue has to be the juvenile middle, the social. You in the waiting where what you're doing, the social coordination mechanism is about regaining the social. You know, the interaction, the community where people are in. The social is the place of encountering limit,
Well,
encountering constraints. We've lost the social. It's been we all we have is the individual or the state. We don't have the social, the middle.
yeah.
The middle has to be regained, but the middle has to be regained by the quality of global pluralism, because that is the only way by which you can have internally consistent systems
Yes.
encounter
Yes.
limits
Yes.
and thus give rise to a complexity they wouldn't have before. That's the work that we're doing now. But that absolutely can look like uselessness in the Julian Binde because you're just having Zoom calls. You're just spending,
Yeah.
you're not getting paid. What are you doing with your time? So there's a kind of waiting, or at the very least, a sort of
You're
you're
not
doing
doing.
nothing with your
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
It has to look like a nothingness to be apathetic in a way. It has to look like a nothingness to be creative in that kind of Kyoto sense, or the Benda sense. Like the humanities for Benda is the defense of the useless. You're
Yeah.
doing something that's useless, but that's why it can be creative.
Yeah.
If it's not useless, then it's not creative. You know, but in a world where we don't have the social, and the social is necessary for the constraints to surprise us by which we complexify into sainthood and beauty, then the useless is a matter of life and death. And we basically have to bring back the useless with a new technological infrastructure by which that can emerge, which is the social coordination mechanism. But please.
Well, I mean, I was thinking about what, this idea that you can't have others come in, like the other actually does present to you what you could receive as a limit,
Yes.
but it can't be the engineered other telling you what
Yes.
should be your constraint. Now,
No.
I will say in a time of givens that happened a lot with elders. Like elders would basically say, like, you're,
Sure,
you
sure,
know,
sure, sure. And because that was acceptable by that historical contingency, of which was the level of complexity fitting for that moment in history. And certainly, I'm not saying that elders can't tell you, but there. Let me put it this way: there is a danger the moment somebody says, "I know what you need." Like,
Mhm.
I see what's wrong from the outside because they don't have skin in the game, they're not
Yeah.
invested. One should not be quick to take that sort of position.
Right. But actually, there could be a time if you're actually embedded in the same reality and context
Yes.
where, as an elder, you actually need to speak up to say something. And it's not like what I mean to say is like your role maybe not just to be like you, but you have to do this, but more so that this is something that you should be aware about for
Yes.
yourself.
The
And then
role.
it leaves it with that other person. I guess because of like again this idea of you do actually have to be actively doing things in
Yes.
order to encounter otherness by
Yes.
which you could then receive that
Yes.
organic,
Yes.
unfolded,
Yes.
or unfolding constraint that presents
Yes.
itself to you.
Yes.
So this isn't like certainly the whole point is not to just like literally sit around doing nothing, being
Yes.
hikikomori, not leaving your
Yes.
house and never talking
Yes.
to other
Waiting for the
people.
event or whatever.
Yeah, because if people say, well, to what degree is doing things, you know, becoming uh like engineering a type of constraint? Like, because people also have to make choices, right? So
There's a
couldn't they?
certain sense in which I wanna say your job is to be as constrained as possible. Like, in the sense of get committed, get married, get a job, give yourself over to things, constrain yourself as much as possible, and then increase flow. Like,
Yeah,
constrain
yeah,
yourself as much as possible, and then encounter as much otherness as you can. See, we have a lot of
yeah, yeah,
people
yeah,
that,
yeah.
like,
Do the opposite.
yes, the conservative says you ought to get as constrained, commit, like, as
Yeah,
much as you
and then
can,
also, but don't increase flow with
but don't
otherness,
increase flow.
right?
Where the liberal could be like increase flow without constraint. And in fact, they say, well, if you increase constraint,
You're not
you're
allowing
not going to
flow.
be able to flow,
Yeah.
right? And you could argue for most of history, yeah, those were the choices. Now you can get as constrained as possible, committed, give yourself over to someone, give your life over to someone, and then still interact with otherness because we have the social coordination mechanism. That's the sweet spot. Is you want to constrain yourself,
Mhm,
make real choices, give yourself over to something, and then put yourself in the context of encountering otherness. And that is emergence. That's where emergence can happen.
mhm. Yeah, and I think too this idea of like the testing of that is interesting too because like I think about it, I don't mean to keep going back to this, but it is kind of an interesting analogy that I like to think about. But like this the concept of like fertility, for example, like not every conception is viable actually ultimately, right? So like it doesn't always necessarily lead to some like
No, it's the
it's
testing.
a
You keep
testing, right?
redoing.
It
It's like
keep
the market.
exactly.
Yes.
You keep redoing, and then yes, eventually, if that is meant to be the emergence, it will come forth, right?
Yes,
But
by
you
selection.
don't like that. If you close off to that, you never know. Like you have not opened up yourself to the possibility of that basically that cultivation, like
There's
that.
gonna be 10,000 versions of what makes a good vacuum, and the market will select for the good vacuum, or it's ideally without state intervention, special interest, blah, blah, blah. We have to get into
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
all of that, how actually I would argue the social coordination mechanism is necessary for the creativity that maintains a creative destruction to keep the market from being efficient versus getting captured and all that other stuff. But similarly, the social coordination mechanism is a testing and experimentation of determining very, you could say spiritual, development of spirit, development of character to find out what works, what doesn't, and we do that sort of test because right now we don't have the infrastructure to know. You need guessing. And I guess I wanted to say also, I think the role of elders now, elders absolutely have a role. The elder is increasingly moving to the position of seeing what you need to do to actually realize the constraints you need to bind themselves by. Whereas in the past, the elder might have been able to tell you the exact constraints you needed.
Mhm,
Now the elder is more in the role of telling you what you need to do so that the constraints can unveil themselves to you, or what constraints that you need at this point in your life so that the next level of constraints can unveil themselves to you, say when
mhm,
you're 50, so that you're in position for that, right?
mhm,
Because there can be different levels of constraints based at different times of your life
mhm,
and so on and so forth, right? So I think the elder has to have a much more fluid and discerning role now. The elder is actually extremely important. We've talked about that with Cleo and
mhm.
Joel
Yeah,
and
it's a
others,
huge role
but
that's
definitely
necessary.
there's the elder still has a role, but they've got to have a much more kind of garden organic sort of seeing how the pieces kind of lead to this and
Mhm,
that and seeing what you need to do. They're going to have more of a role of discerning what you need to learn what only you can learn, which sounds kind of weird because there are things like that only you can learn for yourself, but there are things that you need to do in order to be into the place where you can learn something that only you can learn. The elder is actually in that business increasingly of knowing, of discerning what someone needs to do in order to learn what only they can learn, if that makes
mhm,
sense. And that's more of a, you could in a sense say apathetic role than capathetic
mhm.
in the past. But let me throw it to you.
It does make me think too of the fact that it almost feels like I don't know, for lack of a better analogy, like it's like cooking, right? It was like, okay, a little bit of this, we need a little bit of that. We don't,
Yes.
but there's also this real sense in which you realize that ultimately, as an elder, you what you offer is that merely that it can be taken or not taken,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And I think that the
And I don't
issue,
even know what the result will be if you take it. But I know that you need a result that I can't know ahead of time in that area based on your circumstance. You see these kind of strange moves that have to be made where the elder can recognize you need to figure that out. But I don't know what the thing is you're going to figure out, but I know you need to have that answer experience, not
mm,
just told, and only you can have that experience. Or else it won't be full bodied and it won't actually change you or something.
yeah, no, that's all good. And there's I, mm, yeah, because it does feel like does
And I would
there's
say that's the advice of philosophy in general.
yeah, I was gonna say there's something that almost is a philosophical mode that the elder
Absolutely.
represents and
Absolutely.
embodies and does, for our benefits. And we're so needed. It's needed now probably more than ever. I mean, maybe
Yes.
because especially because of global pluralism, and yet, unfortunately, that there's not always a robust discussion of, or there's not a robust presence of the elders with younger generations. So yeah, I mean, this is all very good, and that's so important on the elders because again, I think we don't have a very I think we don't have a very good like understanding of the importance and the role of elders in like, and I think that's kind of causing issues intergenerationally for sure. um so yeah, and I had a question just because again this idea of like waiting around for the for um I guess I'm just thinking like what about for somebody who it's perception but like they feel stuck and they don't jettison out to make commitments or devotions to certain things or
Yeah, yeah,
disciplines
yeah,
to
yeah.
certain things, and they're like, well, I'm just being open to receive. Now this is where the action inaction is so interesting because you have
Yes,
to think about like what is the quality of your inaction slash action, because they're always related actually. But
yes,
like for example, I mean, to counteract my own point there is like, I guess I would say that again, it's not about not doing anything, it's about doing the things in which you could receive. Like for example, um whether you like her work or not, but like, doesn't Elizabeth Gilbert say something about like, I mean, this is like Picasso.
yeah,
Lots of artists have said this, but
yes,
like this idea of showing up to the work, to do the work, and you don't demand the muse, but the muse may
uh-huh,
show up, sort of thing.
yes,
So like, you can't receive if you're not doing the action of, or the discipline of writing, or the discipline of whatever it is, or
yes,
so you can't put yourself in a place to receive if you're not there. You know what I mean? If you're not available, if you're not open. So, but I do want to say, like, I could hear somebody saying that and being like, well, great, I was going to make decisions, but I guess I won't now.
yes,
Because
yes.
like, well, because maybe my decisions are just engineering my constraints, so, but then
Yes,
again, you already said that, like, actually constrain yourself as much as possible, and that's
yes.
in some senses. So, what would you say to that?
Uh, so if you feel stuck, ironically, constraint would seem to be the exact opposite of what you want. But we actually tend to feel stuck when we
Exactly.
don't have enough constraint.
Exactly.
That's kind of
Exactly.
the key to complexity. Is that if you feel stuck, and also please note, constraints are not necessarily good, just like every product is not necessarily good.
Right.
We have to
Exactly.
test
We
them.
really
If
do,
you
because
feel
yeah.
stuck, try different constraints. Pick if you don't have any constraints, try different ones. Or maybe you're stuck. I'm just going to make an example. So you're stuck, but let's say your constraint is you're at home every day between 5 and 10, or you have certain constraints. Well, go work on your computer in a library between 5 and 10. Like, change your
Yeah.
constraint and
Yeah.
commit to it. Like, I think what people tend to do when they feel stuck is they then try a bunch of different things to see if something interests them. The problem with that is it's spurious. What
Yes,
you actually
exactly. And
want
that's the
to
thing.
do
Yeah.
is
What's the
commit to something, not just try a bunch of stuff. But now that's going to entail trying, but not be merely trying.
yeah.
So maybe like you can say, well, I'll try jujitsu. Okay, we'll do it for 3 months, not just 1 week, but for 3 months. And then maybe after 3 months, you say, well, that didn't do it. Or there's I think so. The two key qualities is constraint and flow, though. So if you just have constraint but not flow, then that could get you into the pathologies of conservatism. But if you have flow without constraint, that can get you into pathologies of liberalism. So if you feel stuck in your life, ask, look for constraints that also increase flow.
Mm,
Like, and flow here would be interaction. So, as an example, like even just a little thing where instead of working in your office, but working in a library, a public space, that's a constraint. You're committing to doing that every afternoon at 5, and you're in a place of flow, especially if you then force yourself to look up and say hi to 3 people,
yeah.
right? So, constraint plus flow, not merely constraint, so a lot of the capitalist ethos of getting out of stuckness is to increase flow, travel, get new experiences, do new things. But there's not enough constraint. But then the other, I guess I want to say, perhaps more religious impulse can be, we'll just get more roots in Simone Weil, get more constraint. And that can certainly give you belonging, but then it can lead to the pathologies of old forms of
Mhm,
belonging. You need constraint plus flow. So look at your life and ask, what is, so you say, well, I'm going to give myself over to writing. All right, give yourself over to writing, do that every single morning, but then simultaneously try to connect or interact with other people doing writing, or bring your ideas into conversations with people. So then the constraints has a quality of flow to it as well. So you need the vertical and the horizontal is another
yeah.
way to put it.
Yeah.
So stuckness, a feeling of stuckness, which is interesting, a feeling of a lack of energy. Like it's an energetic claim,
Mhm,
right? It's an energetic claim. It's an energy that has lost complexity,
mhm,
and the loss of complexity, and which would be beauty and virtue and all these things, and I do think those overlap even if there are differences. That is a result of you're either lacking in flow or you're lacking in constraint. You
mm.
don't have enough of both of those, so you need to think in those terms.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I think there could be a way in which someone's like, well, Daniel, you said about like let the constraints unfold themselves
Yes,
towards you, but then
yes,
you also said constrain yourself as much as possible.
yes,
So
yes.
what is
No, you let the emergence reveal itself as much as possible, but the constraint, so you have to, that's a good question. There's a constraint of, I'm going to give myself over to Christianity. So you're constrained by Christianity. But then you have the flow by which you interact with people who
Mhm.
are not Christian. And then there's a sense, another constraint that unveils
Yes,
itself.
yes,
So that constraint then affords the emergentism. So
yes.
that's where
You let
there's
that present itself to you by
yes,
your receptivity to
there's a
receive.
way in which the constraint that is revealed to you cannot be revealed to you unless there's a constraint you've imposed upon yourself first. So there's a chosen constraint, if you will, like Christianity or writing, that then you put yourself in a flow by which you can encounter the constraint that only the other can bring.
Hmm.
And now we
Hmm.
can get complexity.
Yeah,
Now we can get
yeah.
emergence, right? So there's twofold, but that's a very good question. So there's a clarification there that's needed, because the problem is if you only have a chosen constraint, then it can feel arbitrary or self, it can kind of lose its life. But then if you have a constraint that you didn't choose, was imposed, well, that can be totalitarian. So you need the Nietzschean law you hang around your neck, the chosen constraint. You have to choose a limit, but then you need to bring that limit that you've chosen into contact with other chosen limits. And that then creates a constraint that is not chosen in the intersupposition, as I've called it, the
Hmm.
interrelate, the encounter of the in the encounter of the
Hmm.
chosen
Hmm.
limits.
Hmm.
Then you can have a limit that neither chose, that emerges between them. And in that emerges, there is a possibility of complexity based on how the subjects respond. If
Hmm.
they disown what emerges between them, or if they own it and try to add it to their map, add it to their internally consistent, well, that's complexity. Like, so you have the constraint that is your internally consistent system of Christianity. Then you encounter, say, an internally consistent system of the atheist or something. Then that unveils a constraint, that unveils ideas you've never heard before. And
Hmm.
now, can you integrate those ideas that
Hmm.
surprised you into your Christianity? And if so, you've complexified it.
Hmm.
You've made it
Hmm.
more complex. You've given it thoughts and
Hmm.
ideas and dimensions that it otherwise would not. But the trick is you have to add the new ideas in a manner that honors the orthodoxy, honors the original constraints, not ignore them, right? But then the question is, well, what are the original constraints needed for Christianity to stay Christian? So there's a negotiation that's going on, okay? But that gets into the appearing heretical, not being heretical,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
appearing heretical. That all creates a developmental feedback loop. That all develops a kind of complexification that wouldn't occur otherwise. And as it's happening for the Christians, happening for the atheists, happening for the communists, the capitalist, blah blah blah. Right. So that's why it's the constraint, the chosen. Let's say this: the chosen constraint and flow creates the conditions of possibility for the revealed constraint, of which then is an invitation to complexification
Yes.
that otherwise could not occur. And that invitation to complexification is what people increasingly need to experience and accept so that global pluralism isn't auto-cannibalistic. And so that beauty can emerge that otherwise would never emerge. And that's this is us.
Yeah, that's all very good, and thank you for the clarification. And I think that was well said. It does make me think about this idea that, going back to the idea of emergence, that the the temptation of our human brains is just to kind of subsume it all, right? Like, well, that means that, either all of it's true or none of it's true or whatever. But emergence, if we could think about it more like a child, like it is like the
Yes, it's like
child,
a child.
then
Yes,
that is, to
yes,
me, that's why I think the procreative analogy is so helpful, because it is its own thing. It is its
yes,
own thing,
yes,
but it's necessary,
yes,
and it is going to complexify your
yes,
relations
yes,
to
yes,
yourself, to your, to the other, to the other, in the sense of, like, if we think about it, the triad, like the child complexifies your relationship to yourself, to your husband, and to the child. Like
yes,
but it's also, that
yes,
complexity is also life itself, and it's
yes.
and it's
The
and it's
complexity is
beautiful.
life itself.
It is life
Yes.
itself, and it is beautiful, and it is
Or it destroys you. Like
yeah. I mean,
if you have kids and you can't handle it, that's the thing. Beauty judges. Beauty joy
yeah, yeah,
judges.
George, yep.
Complexity is Lovecraft with the craft in parentheses.
Exactly, exactly. Um, but yeah, it's like the yeah, there's something about that where it's yeah, it's there's something about the complexity that is that needs to be embraced as its own thing, so that you can live in light of it and live differently because of it.
Yes.
Um, and I don't know, just thinking about the word, like,
Well,
complexion, right? Like it changes your complexion, in the complexity.
yes. I mean, once you have a kid, you're never the same. Even if the kid goes off to college and leaves, you're not the same person. Their
Yeah.
lack changes you,
Right.
right? So you never go back. Well, but that gets into the, and I know we're way over
Yeah, yeah. We'll
with time.
wrap it up.
Um, so a few things. First, the way to look at emergentism with this very interesting dimension of constraint is you could say that everything kind of spreads out. I want to use Ebert's language, saturated, spreads out horizontally, but then it eventually hits a limit. And that limit, in a way, pushes it up. And now it's on a new plane. And then it kind of goes out until it reaches a limit. And then it kind of goes to a new, because it pushes vertically once it hits the horizontal. So that's kind of a visual way to look at it. But what the $1,000,000 question is, what are those limits? Because if they're transcendent of if this is everything expanding and then it hits something
Mhm,
and it goes vertical, then you're saying nothing is the limit, right? Because, right? So this is the thing. Everything has to entail within it limits on itself
mhm,
that then in its saturation pushes it vertically into a new emergence, or Bard would say transcendental emergence, right? So what are those limits? Are they outside of everything or are they latent in everything?
mhm,
This is all pointing to the limits can be lack, where lack is not nothing. Lack exists because of finitude, and lack actually then is the constraint latent in everything that makes emergence possible. But there's $1,000,000 question here that we will not get into on what is finitude? Like, what is finitude? Um, because in the same way that Nietzsche warned, often we just define the good as not the bad.
yeah.
But then, of course, that doesn't tell us positively what is the good.
Right.
There is a way in which most of the time when we talk about finitude, it's not the infinite. But and that though doesn't tell us what it is. And there's a kind of actually well deep metaphysical question on
Mhm.
what exactly is finitude. And it gets into a lot.
Yeah.
Because the more definitive a thing, the more fine. The secret is that the more finite a thing is, the more infinite it becomes. The
Mhm,
more woman
mhm,
becomes Michelle, the more Michelle is infinite. So then
mhm,
it would actually suggest that the saturation point of a finite phenomenon is the point where it actually becomes infinite, and that's the vertical move. Like it's actually when and this is at the end, I shouldn't, but it is actually in some strange way when the full finitude of chemistry is realized that a certain infinity opens up about it that then gives you biology.
mhm,
Almost like Ebert's play on the determinate and the indeterminate being two sides of the same coin. Now, I don't want to get into any of that, but that's something being pointed to. The thing I did want to get into for a moment is what you're saying about having a child. This is the tension that say every tradition is in, and we'll just say Christianity. Like Christianity today is like, well, what we need to do is go back to the origin. Go back to the origin, the original Christianity, and that's going to be what deals with our moment. The problem with that is that could be saying, like, you're having trouble in your marriage or you're having trouble as a parent. You say, I need to go back to before I had the child. I
Mhm.
need to go
Mhm.
back because the key is that Christianity is inseparable, and this applies to every movement.
Yeah,
It is inseparable from history.
absolutely.
History is a process of having children
Exactly.
in this sense. History is a process of complexification.
Yes.
Christianity, so likewise, as Christianity goes through history, it has children. It complexifies. It can never go back to the origin.
Yeah.
And if you go back to the origin, you're disowning your children.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, the problem. You don't liberal like people are talking about the problems of liberalism. Liberalism gave you freedom, women's rights. It gave you optionality. It gave you the ability to be someone other than just whatever your parents were, right? Now that, of course, also is a freedom that could destroy you in the
Mhm.
same way beauty could destroy you. But you also can't go back to the mode of subjectivity that was pre-modern.
Yeah.
In the same way you can't go back to being the you before you had kids,
Mhm.
right? You are forever different. So the only option is to handle the complexification and integrate. And integral theory is layman and Bruce, like integration is a big term, and that means many things, and we have to get into what that means.
Yeah.
But there's a certain integration that you are no longer who you were, which you could say in a way is a kind of integration of a lack, but it's
Mhm.
a lack that is apathetic because you're ever changing. It's creative. It's not
Yeah.
completely absent, but there's a certain integration that has to occur. But the key is also in a weird way, you have to identify yourself as a mother but in a manner that also feels like it's consistent with who you were before you were a mother. So
Mhm.
this is what like Christianity is trying to do. It's like,
Mhm.
okay, 2026 Christianity is not the same as Christianity of 100 AD, but it also has to feel consistent with it.
Yes.
Otherwise, you have a psychological breakdown. Like the woman or the man who feels like they have no relation to themselves before they were a parent or a husband, they have trouble, right? Because they don't, there's repression,
Mhm.
right? But this is um a activity, an intellectual, psychological activity that you could argue demands philosophy, it demands elders, it demands community to do. And Christianity right now is caught in this tension of honoring its origin, honoring what it was, but in a way that integrates with what it now is, that it must accept. Because if
Mhm.
it tries to disown what it now is and goes back, it's going back to something that it can't go back to. Because even if it goes back, it doesn't even realize that it's different. Like Christianity today doesn't realize how different it is in 2026 than what it is in 100 AD. Like it couldn't go back
Absolutely.
to the origin if it wanted to. But that's okay.
Mhm.
That's actually a good thing.
Right.
Because now a beauty is possible that was, I would argue, a beauty is possible that couldn't have been possible before. That could destroy us, though. A greater beauty is possible that therefore is more likely to destroy us, but if we can rise to its occasion, can have a greater beauty than possible before. And that's tied to many. That's our moment.
Yeah.
But I know we're out of time. But
I
definitive, please,
It's
please.
just really, really quick. Again, because I've been so on the procreation analogy, but I was thinking about how interesting it is embryonically, like where the cell divides.
Yes.
This is like its division is its
Yes.
multiplication.
Yes.
Like,
Yes. There's a
so
limit that's hit. It
yeah,
has
yeah.
to divide, and that actually gives you
Chris,
complexity.
exactly. The
Right.
complexity of the
There
human
is only
being, like
so
the
much, but
body,
that gets into the
incredible.
West scaling law. Like
Yeah.
there's like a tree at a certain point can't get any bigger because of the limits of like growth, or like humans only get to a certain height because of metabolism. There are
Hmm.
limits that naturally scale, and because they naturally scale, you get diverse and living ecosystems. The problem with the technological essence, as Wes talks about, is it doesn't naturally scale. Flatness and smooth lines don't follow natural scaling laws, so they can become cancerous and destroy the world. We have to choose their limit.
Well,
We
and that's
have
the
to
thing. We have
choose
to
it, which is
interpret.
non-rational,
Yeah.
and we can't even think the
But
non-rational.
that's why it's important to think about the internet actually as a type of constraint.
Yes,
Like where you see,
absolutely.
oh, the cells are dividing and therefore a new life is coming forth,
Yes,
right? It's
yes,
actually in that division, it's
yes,
creating
yes,
the
yes,
multiplication and
yes,
the proliferation of
yes,
complexity for
yes,
a new body and
yes,
being and life to come forth.
yes,
But that is like that has to be your basically your ability to see to not only to recognize, because I
yes,
do think it is in a sense kind of latent in it, but it's just that you have to come to recognize that
yes.
that is
The
actually
attention, the
yeah.
orientation, Simone was
Yeah,
talking
and
about.
actually, like, make it go from the negative of I'm constrained to this thing I keep doom scrolling on to this is my constraint for my potential unlimitedness, or like this is this could be a limit for my
This
unlimitedness.
this is the limit I need to not be cancerous, as Ebert would talk about, like because cancer is like as
Mhm.
Ebert said, is a cell that won't stop it won't die. And so you need a limit not to die. And yet we tend to associate limits with death.
Yeah, right. And that's the thing. Death is like it's kind of like and this is it's almost like the fear of okay. Back to like just really quick the fortressing buttressing thing. Like, I'm going to
Yes,
do this so this doesn't die. Unfortunately, though,
that
you've
kills you.
suffocated yourself off from everything that is going to infuse and bring about new life.
Yes,
So death is
yes,
inevitable in that situation anyway. So like
yes.
what are you going to do? Are you going to open up yourself to the potential of risk, or are you going to like not and then I don't know, in a sense, kind of like what you fear is what comes onto you in that
Well,
regard.
what will happen? So, as an example, is if
That might be
Christianity,
abstract, but
no,
sorry.
no, it's very important. I mean, what Christianity is now tempted to do, and I just make that example, but it applies to everything, is go back to the origin, which can have a certain fortressing,
Instead of
instead of
honoring.
figuring out the integration, which
Right,
is
right.
extremely difficult work.
Sorry, but you're gonna say.
Um, that fortressing will work until the next culture war, the next ethical real. Because why did the
Well, that's the
emergent
thing.
church?
You see the death of populations, and not death. I don't mean like,
Yes,
but the numbers. The
yes,
numbers, like if you see like church populations dwindling, then that is a type of death of that institution,
yes,
and
yes,
so you
and you
have to
could.
reckon with that.
Yes, and you could argue it's coming back into vogue, and maybe there's a rise in Christianity, but not church attendance. The Pew Research numbers are very confusing. They don't show that. But the point is that there will be another. Like right now, the culture war issues have kind of pushed back because you could argue it's because there's war and geopolitical and economic issues that but there will be another culture war. It will be on gene editing, maybe CRISPR or something. It's coming. And if you've not learned to complexify, or to be able to handle other, and by complexity, the problem is though with when you say to, it kind of sounds like a hierarchy. You're complex and other people are not complex or whatever. Every single encounter, I want to really locate complexification and not being a kind of stable state that you have, but
Mm,
something that only is ever as real as the moment and encounter itself with otherness
yeah,
that you don't have control over. So
yeah,
whatever complexity you have is not something that's yours per se.
yeah,
It is,
exactly.
you
It's
don't get
not.
to choose how to use it. So there has, and the reason why stressing encounter is big is because you have to talks about some sort of development, something like development, without creating a hierarchy that's dangerous. And yet there is some kind of hierarchy that's good, but it's an encounter, it's a hierarchy in encounter,
Yeah,
not in state. So
yeah,
you can't take it with you beyond the encounter,
sure,
if you will,
exactly,
other than the memory of it, but it's
exactly.
not in your control. And so that all has to be gotten into. But the point is that if you create a fortress, you're going to be fragile, and you're
Mhm.
going to be fragile for the next surprise that's going to be the ethical real to kind of play off Zupanchik and Lacan, and it will just be another deconstruction movement in Christianity like the 2010s. It will just come back over and over
Mhm.
again. There is way more to say, um, but good talking to you.
Good talking to you too,
Good talking to
beloved.
you.
Yes, we'll accept our limit here.
Yeah, there we go. There we go. For complexification.
We're
But yes, I just think it's super important for all talks of emergence to be in limit. Because when you talk about emergence, it sounds like transcendence. I'm
Mhm.
overcoming limit. And that's so much. The absolute choice is all about accepting limit or denying limit. And we really, if we're going to talk about emergentism, it must be extremely focused on the constraint
Mhm.
that affords emergence, not on the emergence after constraint that runs the risk of forgetting the constraint. Because the
Mhm.
moment you forget the constraint, all your talk of emergentism is not going to serve anything new. It's probably going to actually, ironically, fall into power
Yeah.
dynamics, othering, and all of the stuff you're supposedly transcending.
Yeah.
And that can happen in Christianity, and so on and so forth. And the question then becomes, what is finitude that creates a reality that does this? And what are the limits
Mm,
themselves? What are different qualities of limits? There's the limit that is this table, but then there's the limit of me not being able to access your mind. And what is the differences in those limits? What are real essential limits versus arbitrary limits that
yes.
we can overcome without losing complexification?
Yeah.
And how do we engage in a mechanism of testing to determine those differences? But that gets into belonging again, and all of that. But for more by OG Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Insta. I said Anchor, Spotify, blah, YouTube.
You too.
Buy books, please. All reviews are really
Appreciated.
appreciated, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.